The biting wind of a Massachusetts January gnawed at the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks surrounding the Abbey of St. Jude. Snow, a relentless shroud, had begun its slow, methodical descent the previous night, now blanketing the grounds in an unbroken expanse of white. Inside the stone walls, the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old paper, a comforting aroma that usually brought solace. But on this particular morning, a different, more acrid scent hung heavy, the metallic tang of fear. Brother Thomas, his face a pale mask against his dark habit, wrung his hands, his knuckles white. "He's gone, Detective. Just gone." Detective Eleanor Vance, a woman whose presence commanded attention despite her unassuming tweed coat, surveyed the sparse room. A narrow cot, neatly made, and a small wooden desk with a single unlit candle. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, just the lingering chill of an empty space. "Brother Peter, you said." Her voice was crisp, professional, cutting through the heavy silence of the monastery. "Yes, Peter. He was scheduled for morning prayers. Didn't show. We thought perhaps he was ill, but his bed hadn't been slept in." Brother Thomas's voice cracked. "He was so young, barely 18. Just joined us a few months ago." Eleanor walked to the window, peering out at the swirling snow. The abbey, a formidable structure of grey stone, seemed to absorb the light, casting long, somber shadows. "And no one saw anything? Heard anything?" Brother Thomas shook his head, his gaze fixed on the empty cot. "The abbey is quiet at night, Detective. Everyone keeps to their cells. We are a community of prayer, not of gossip." His tone held a hint of defensiveness. Eleanor turned, her eyes sharp and intelligent, meeting his. "Even in a place of devotion, human nature persists, Brother Thomas. Jealousy, ambition, resentment. Are there any such currents flowing beneath the surface here?" Brother Thomas flinched as if struck. "Detective, this is a holy place. Our lives are dedicated to God. And sometimes, brother, the greatest darkness can hide in the holiest of places." Eleanor's gaze swept over the small collection of religious texts on the desk. "When was the last time anyone saw Brother Peter?" "Yesterday evening after Compline. He seemed normal, quiet, as always. A good boy." Brother Thomas's voice trailed off. Eleanor opened a small notebook, scribbling notes with a fountain pen. "And the doors? Were they locked?" "Always, from the inside at night. No one can enter or leave without being seen unless—" Brother Thomas hesitated, his eyes wide. "Unless what?" Eleanor prompted. "Unless they knew a way out. But that's impossible. The walls are high, the gates secure." Eleanor didn't dismiss his words outright, but her expression remained skeptical. She walked to the door of the cell, examining the heavy wooden frame. No forced entry. It was as if Brother Peter had simply vanished into thin air. The silence in the abbey was no longer comforting. It was oppressive, a heavy blanket that seemed to muffle not just sound, but thought itself. The snow continued to fall, adding to the growing sense of isolation. Eleanor felt a prickle of unease. This wasn't a simple runaway. The meticulous order of the cell, the lack of any sign of struggle, it all pointed to something far more unsettling. "I'll need to speak to everyone who had contact with Brother Peter yesterday," Eleanor stated, her voice firm. "And I'll need a detailed map of the abbey grounds. Every entrance, every exit, every hidden passage, if there are any." Brother Thomas's brow furrowed. "Hidden passages? Detective, this is an abbey, not a castle." "Nevertheless," Eleanor said, her gaze unwavering, "I need to understand every inch of this place. If someone disappeared without a trace, there has to be an explanation, and usually, the simplest explanation is the most overlooked." As she left the cell, the chill in the air seemed to deepen, seeping into her bones. The Abbey of St. Jude, once a beacon of spiritual calm, now felt like a cage, its stone walls holding secrets as cold and unyielding as the winter itself. Eleanor knew, with a certainty that settled heavy in her stomach, that this disappearance was just the beginning. The strange vanishing of the Abbey Acolytes had only just begun to unfold. If you're captivated by the mystery unfolding within the Abbey of St. Jude, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories. This is a work of fiction. The frigid air in the Abbey's long, echoing corridors seemed to amplify every sound. The creak of old wood, the distant clang of a bell, even the soft shuffle of Eleanor's own boots on the flagstones. Brother Thomas, still visibly shaken, led her through the labyrinthine passages. The heavy oak doors to each cell were uniform, anonymous, adding to the sense of impenetrable privacy within the monastic order. Their first stop was the abbot's study. Father Michael, a man whose stern features were softened by eyes that held a surprising depth of sorrow, greeted Eleanor with a measured solemnity. His desk was meticulously organized, a stark contrast to the growing disarray in Eleanor's own mind as she tried to piece together this baffling puzzle. "Detective Vance," Father Michael said, his voice a low rumble. "This is a grave matter. We have never experienced anything like this." Brother Peter was a gentle soul, devout. The thought of him, gone, it chills us to the bone. Eleanor observed him closely. He spoke with conviction, yet there was a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher in his eyes. Concern, yes, but perhaps something else. "Father, I understand the sanctity of this place, but a young man has vanished. I need to understand the daily routines, the relationships between the brothers. Was Brother Peter having any difficulties? Arguments with anyone?" Father Michael sighed, running a hand over his smooth, bald head. "Our life here is one of contemplation and quiet devotion. Disagreements are rare and usually resolved through prayer and penance. Brother Peter was a quiet boy, kept mostly to himself. He had no known enemies." "And friends?" Eleanor pressed. "Did he confide in anyone?" "He was closest to Brother Anthony, perhaps," the abbot mused. "They often studied together in the scriptorium." Eleanor made a note. "I'd like to speak with Brother Anthony, and anyone else who saw him last. What about access to the outside world? Mail? Visitors?" "Mail is collected and distributed by Brother Joseph. Visitors are rare and are always recorded. The gates are guarded by Brother Matthew during the day and locked from the inside at night. No one leaves without explicit permission, and a record is kept." Eleanor's gaze swept the room again, taking in the theological texts, the crucifix on the wall, and the abbey itself. "Are there any parts that are less frequented? Basements, disused wings, anything that might not be part of the daily routine?" Father Michael hesitated for a moment. "There is the old crypt beneath the chapel, and a few storage rooms in the cellar, but they are rarely used and kept locked. I'll need access to them," Eleanor stated firmly. The abbot nodded, a slight frown on his face. "Of course, Detective. We will cooperate fully. Our only desire is to find Brother Peter." As they left the abbot's study, Brother Thomas led Eleanor to the scriptorium. It was a vast room, filled with the scent of aged parchment and ink. Here, amidst rows of ancient texts, Eleanor found Brother Anthony, his head bowed over a beautifully illuminated manuscript. He was younger than many of the other monks, with an earnest, almost fragile demeanor. When Brother Anthony looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale. "Brother Peter." "It's true, then?" His voice was a bare whisper. Eleanor nodded. "I'm trying to find him. Can you tell me anything about him? Was he troubled? Did he seem worried about anything?" Brother Anthony gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He was a good man, so devout. But sometimes he seemed restless. Not in a bad way, just thoughtful. He would often ask questions about the outside world, about why we chose this path. Questions about leaving the order? Eleanor probed gently. Brother Anthony shook his head quickly. No, never. He was committed, but he had a family outside, a younger sister, I believe. He spoke of her sometimes with great affection. He missed them. This was a new detail. Did he ever receive letters from her, or send any? I believe so. Brother Joseph would know. He handles all the mail. The plot thickened. A young man, devout, but perhaps conflicted, with ties to the outside world. Eleanor's mind began to race, piecing together the fragments. She thanked Brother Anthony and left him to his grief and his illuminated texts. The abbey, with its silent, stone-faced inhabitants, was slowly revealing its secrets, one hushed whisper at a time. The echoes in the cloister were starting to tell a story that felt far more complex and human than the simple narrative of a devout disappearance. The weight of the falling snow outside pressed against the abbey walls, mirroring the pressure building within Eleanor as she navigated this labyrinth of faith and hidden truths. The snow continued its relentless fall, transforming the landscape outside into an endless canvas of white. Inside the Abbey of St. Jude, the air grew colder, the silence deeper, as if the very walls were absorbing the light and sound. Eleanor, accompanied by the increasingly uneasy Brother Thomas, descended into the abbey's cellars. The descent was literal and metaphorical, leading her deeper into the hidden workings of the monastery. The air in the cellar was damp and smelled of earth and decay. Cobwebs, thick and ancient, clung to the rough-hewn stone walls. The only light came from the flickering lantern held by Brother Thomas, casting dancing shadows that made the already oppressive space feel even more foreboding. They passed rows of dusty wine casks, their labels faded with time, and shelves laden with jars of preserved fruits and vegetables. "This is where we store our provisions," Brother Thomas explained, his voice low, almost a whisper in the echoing space. "Most of it is rarely touched, only in dire emergencies or during the deepest winter months." Eleanor's gaze swept over the dusty shelves, looking for anything out of place. Her detective's instinct, a finely honed instrument, hummed with a quiet unease. It wasn't just the cold or the gloom, there was a feeling of something unseen, something waiting. They came to a heavy wooden door, bound with an iron chain and a rusty padlock. "This leads to the older section," Brother Thomas explained, fumbling with a ring of keys. "Disused storage mostly. Some old relics, forgotten tools." The padlock creaked in protest as he unlocked it, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. The door groaned open, revealing a deeper, darker recess. The air within was even colder, stagnant and heavy. Eleanor held her lantern higher, pushing past Brother Thomas. The room was larger than she expected, filled with an assortment of forgotten items, broken furniture, religious icons draped in cobwebs, stacks of yellowed parchments, and a few rudimentary tools. Dust lay thick on every surface, undisturbed for what felt like decades. But something caught Eleanor's eye, a faint, almost imperceptible disturbance in the dust near the back wall. She knelt, shining her lantern closer, a faint drag mark leading from the deeper shadows towards the door. It was subtle, easily missed, as if something heavy had been dragged, then covered quickly. Her heart gave a sudden lurch. "What is this area used for exactly?" Eleanor asked, her voice low. Brother Thomas peered over her shoulder, his eyes wide. "Nothing, detective. It's hardly ever entered. Perhaps once a year to check for dampness or pests." Eleanor ran her gloved hand over the disturbed dust. It was fresh, certainly within the last few days. This wasn't an old mark. She stood up, her gaze fixed on the back wall. There was a section where the stones seemed to fit together slightly differently, a faint vertical line that suggested a hidden seam. "Brother Thomas," Eleanor said, her voice taut with a sudden realization. "Is there anything behind this wall?" He looked at the wall, then back at her, his face pale. "Not that I know of, Detective. It's solid stone." Eleanor didn't respond, her mind racing. She moved closer to the wall, her fingers tracing the faint seam. The air here was even colder, carrying a faint, earthy smell that was different from the general mustiness of the cellar. She pushed lightly on the stone, then harder. It didn't budge. "Could this be a secret passage?" Brother Thomas whispered, his eyes widening in horror. "Or a disused opening," Eleanor murmured, her mind already working through possibilities. The drag marks, the recent disturbance. It wasn't a passage, not in the traditional sense. It felt more like a temporary opening, quickly sealed. She pulled out a small hammer from her satchel, a tool she often carried for closer examinations. Gently, methodically, she tapped along the seam. The sound was dull, echoing oddly, until she reached a spot near the bottom where the tap resonated with a slightly hollower sound. She tapped again, harder this time. A faint grating sound, barely audible over the thump of her own heart. She pressed her ear to the stone, listening intently. Nothing. Yet, the feeling of something being behind that wall persisted, a chilling premonition. "Brother Thomas," Eleanor said, turning to him, her face grim. "We need to get someone here with tools, masonry tools. I believe there's something behind this wall, and I believe it's connected to Brother Peter's disappearance." Brother Thomas looked from Eleanor to the wall, his face a mask of dawning horror. The cold truth of the cellar was slowly revealing itself, and it was far more sinister than anyone at the Abbey of St. Jude could have imagined. The silence of the abbey, once a symbol of peace, now felt like a complicit accomplice to a dreadful secret. The rising wind outside howled, a mournful lament for the mysteries buried within the ancient stone. The news of the disturbed wall in the cellar sent a ripple of disquiet through the Abbey of St. Jude. The air grew thick with suspicion, replacing the previous atmosphere of stunned grief. While a small team of groundskeepers, under Eleanor's supervision, began the painstaking work of carefully dismantling the section of the wall, Eleanor returned to the living quarters, her mind still churning. She sought out Brother Joseph, the monk responsible for mail. She found him in a small, cramped office near the abbey's entrance, surrounded by stacks of letters and ledgers. He was an older man, stooped with age, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Brother Joseph," Eleanor began, her voice calm but firm. "I understand you handle all correspondence for the brothers. Did Brother Peter receive or send any letters recently?" Brother Joseph adjusted his spectacles, peering at her over the rim. "Indeed, Detective, all mail passes through my hands. It is part of our commitment to transparency and communal life." He paused, then consulted a large, leather-bound ledger. "Ah, yes. Brother Peter received a letter from his sister Clara just 2 days before his disappearance, and he had prepared a reply to be sent out this morning." "May I see the unsent letter?" Eleanor asked, her pulse quickening. This could be a vital clue. Brother Joseph hesitated. "It is personal correspondence, Detective. It is not our custom to read the brothers' letters." "Brother Joseph, a young man is missing. Any information, no matter how small, could be crucial. This is not about custom. It is about finding him." Eleanor's voice was gentle but unwavering. Reluctantly, Brother Joseph pulled a sealed envelope from a wooden tray. This was waiting to be sent today. He handed it to her. The paper felt thick, the handwriting neat and precise. Eleanor carefully opened the envelope. The letter was dated the day before Brother Peter vanished. It was indeed addressed to his sister Clara. As she read, her brow furrowed. The tone was affectionate, as Brother Anthony had suggested, but beneath the familial pleasantries there was an undercurrent of something else. Brother Peter wrote about the increasing chill of the abbey, not just the weather, but a growing coldness he felt from some of the other brothers. He mentioned feeling watched and experiencing a pervasive sense of unease. He alluded to a discovery he had made, something not right within the abbey's practices, but he was vague, fearing his letter might be intercepted. He spoke of needing to be careful, of a shadow growing longer over the abbey. The letter ended with a promise to write again soon, with more details, once he felt it was safe. Eleanor reread the crucial passage, her mind racing. A discovery. Something not right. A shadow. This wasn't a simple runaway or an accidental disappearance. This was something deliberate, something sinister. "Brother Joseph," Eleanor said, her voice tight with a newfound urgency. "Did Brother Peter ever mention any specific concerns to you? Any issues with other brothers or anything he found irregular?" Brother Joseph shifted uncomfortably. "Brother Peter was a quiet one, as I said, but he did once ask me about certain old texts, obscure theological works. He seemed particularly interested in the Abbey's history and certain financial records from many years ago. I simply told him they were stored in the archive for scholarly purposes." "The archive?" Eleanor repeated, her eyes narrowing. "Where is that located?" "Adjacent to the scriptorium. It requires special permission for access, and Brother Michael, the abbot, holds the key." Eleanor thanked Brother Joseph and left, the unsent letter clutched in her hand. The cold outside seemed to seep into her very bones, but it was the coldness of betrayal and hidden agendas that truly chilled her. Brother Peter wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was a victim of knowledge. He had stumbled upon something the Abbey clearly wanted, kept secret. She made her way back towards the cellar, where the quiet scraping of tools against stone was now audible. The unsent letter was a whisper from the grave, a desperate cry for help that had arrived too late. And the contents of that letter pointed to a disturbing truth. The danger wasn't from outside the Abbey walls, but from within. The pristine sanctity of St. Jude was a facade, concealing a dark heart. The question was, what unspeakable secret was the Abbey so desperately trying to protect, and how far would they go to keep it buried? The answer, Eleanor knew, was waiting behind that cellar wall. If you're gripped by the secrets of the Abbey of St. Jude, make sure to subscribe to the channel for the next chapter of this chilling mystery. This is a work of fiction. The air in the cellar was thick with anticipation. The rhythmic chipping and scraping of tools against stone echoed loudly, each strike bringing Eleanor closer to whatever lay hidden behind the ancient wall. Brother Thomas stood by, his face a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. The groundskeepers, burly men accustomed to physical labor, worked with a focused intensity, aware of the gravity of their task. Finally, with a soft crunch, a section of masonry gave way. A cloud of ancient dust puffed out, carrying with it a faint, earthy odor. As the dust settled, a small, dark opening was revealed. It was not a grand passage, but a narrow, irregular aperture, just large enough for a person to squeeze through. The edges were rough, uneven, suggesting it was an impromptu opening rather than a carefully constructed one. Eleanor immediately shone her lantern into the darkness beyond. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a small, confined space. It was not a crypt, nor a hidden room as she might have expected. Instead, it was a shallow cavity, barely 5 feet deep, leading to a section of the Abbey's foundation. The walls were rough, unmortared stone, clearly part of the original, untouched bedrock. And then she saw it. Lying slumped against the far wall of the cavity, partially obscured by loose earth and rubble, was a figure. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. It was Brother Peter. He was still wearing his novice's habit, but it was torn and soiled. His face, pale and ashen, was contorted in a silent scream, his eyes wide and vacant, staring up into the void. His hands were bound tightly behind his back with rough rope, and a strip of cloth was gagged over his mouth. There was no sign of life. A gasp escaped Brother Thomas's lips, quickly followed by a strangled sob. The groundskeepers recoiled, their faces etched with horror. Eleanor felt a cold dread seep into her bones, but her professional instincts kicked in immediately. "No one touch anything." Her voice, though low, was sharp with authority. She carefully squeezed through the narrow opening, her eyes scanning the scene. The cavity was cramped, claustrophobic. The air was heavy, stagnant, carrying the faint, sweet and sour odor of death. Eleanor knelt beside Brother Peter, her hands hovering, careful not to disturb any potential evidence. His skin was icy cold, rigid. He had been dead for some time, likely since the night he disappeared. She examined the ropes binding his wrists. They were tied in a crude, tight knot, but the fibers were rough, common rope, not something specialized. The gag, a strip of coarse linen, was also tied tightly, clearly meant to silence him. Her gaze fell to the ground beside him. Partially buried in the loose earth was a small, tarnished silver crucifix. It was an ordinary crucifix, but Eleanor noticed a small, almost invisible indentation on the back, as if something sharp had pressed into it. She carefully unearthed it, placing it in an evidence bag. As she straightened up, her eyes caught something else, a faint, almost imperceptible scratch mark on the rough stone wall just above Brother Peter's head. It was a single thin line, barely visible, as if a desperate finger had scraped against the rock in a final, futile gesture. Eleanor stepped back, allowing the groundskeepers to carefully retrieve Brother Peter's body. The silence in the cellar was now absolute, broken only by the muffled sobs of Brother Thomas. The discovery was horrifying, but it also confirmed her suspicions. Brother Peter had been silenced. Someone had known about this hidden cavity, had dragged him here, bound and gagged him, and left him to die. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. Returning to the main part of the cellar, Eleanor observed the groundskeepers carrying the shrouded body. The grim reality of death had now fully permeated the sanctity of the abbey. The monks, who had gathered in hushed groups above, watched with pale faces as the tragic procession passed. Eleanor knew she had to act quickly. The unsent letter from Brother Peter, with its vague accusations and fears, now took on a chilling new significance. He had discovered something not right, a shadow within the abbey, and his discovery had led to his demise. The silver crucifix, the single scratch mark, the hidden cavity, these were fragments of a larger, darker truth. Eleanor felt the weight of the investigation pressing down on her. The pristine facade of the Abbey of St. Jude had crumbled, revealing a truth far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The real questions were just beginning. Who among these devout men was capable of such a heinous act? And what secret was so vital that they would resort to murder to protect it? The answers lay within the deceptive tranquility of the abbey walls, waiting to be unveiled. The discovery of Brother Peter's body transformed the atmosphere in the Abbey of St. Jude from one of quiet mystery to open dread. The local constable, a gruff but competent man named Officer Miller, arrived with a small team, securing the area and beginning the official death investigation. Eleanor, now working in tandem with him, found her own focus sharpening. This was no longer just a disappearance, it was a homicide, and the killer was still among them, cloaked in a monk's habit. Eleanor meticulously documented the scene in the hidden cavity, taking photographs and noting every detail. The single scratch mark on the stone wall continued to bother her, an almost imperceptible clue that felt deeply significant. She returned to the now sealed cellar with Officer Miller, explaining her findings. "The gag and the binding suggest he was silenced and restrained," Eleanor explained, her voice low. "He wasn't able to cry out or resist effectively. And this hidden cavity, someone knew it was here, someone with intimate knowledge of the Abbey's construction." Officer Miller nodded grimly. "Means it's likely an inside job, one of the brothers, or someone living within these walls." The autopsy was scheduled for the following day, a necessary step, but Eleanor felt a growing urgency to uncover the discovery Brother Peter had hinted at in his letter. Her gaze kept returning to the silver crucifix she had found near his body. The faint indentation on the back. It was too specific to be accidental. It was almost as if something had been pressed into it, leaving a mark. She remembered Brother Joseph's mention of Brother Peter's interest in the Abbey's old texts and financial records in the archive. This seemed like the most logical next step. Eleanor confronted Father Michael with the grim news of Brother Peter's death and her intention to access the archive. The abbot's face was ashen, his composure finally cracking under the weight of the tragedy. He handed her a heavy, ornate key without protest. The archive was a large, vaulted room adjacent to the scriptorium, its air heavy with the scent of aged paper and leather. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched into the dimness, laden with ancient manuscripts, theological treatises, and dusty ledgers. Brother Peter's unsent letter still echoed in her mind. Something not right. A shadow growing longer. Eleanor began her search methodically. She started with the oldest records, focusing on financial ledgers and historical documents relating to the Abbey's founding and its benefactors. The cold seeped into her fingers as she meticulously turned brittle pages. Hours passed, marked only by the shifting light outside the high, arched windows. Many of the ledgers were meticulously kept, detailing donations, expenditures, and land holdings. But as she delved deeper, she began to notice a pattern in some of the older financial records from the mid-1800s. There were inconsistencies. Large sums of money, recorded as anonymous donations, flowed into the Abbey's accounts. Not unusual in itself, but the frequency and magnitude of these donations seemed disproportionate for a monastic institution of this size, especially during periods of economic hardship for the surrounding region. Then she found it. A ledger from 1857, its cover faded and worn, marked simply "Special Accounts." This ledger contained entries that were far less detailed than the others. Large withdrawals listed only as expenditures for special projects, with no recipient or purpose specified. And accompanying these withdrawals were notes, written in a cramped, almost indecipherable hand, referring to land acquisitions and relocation expenses in the local town. Eleanor's heart began to pound. Land acquisitions? Relocation expenses? For whom? The Abbey of St. Jude owned significant land, but these entries hinted at something more clandestine. It was then that she noticed something else. A small, almost invisible impression on one of the blank pages in the ledger. A faint indentation left by a previously pressed object. She looked closely. It was the distinct impression of a silver crucifix. Not just any crucifix, but one with a unique, almost imperceptible flaw on its back. The exact same flaw she'd noticed on the crucifix found with Brother Peter's body. Her blood ran cold. The crucifix wasn't just a religious item, it was a marker. Someone had been using this ledger, likely recently, and had used that specific crucifix as a bookmark or a press. And that someone was very likely Brother Peter. He had discovered something in this ledger, something that hinted at illicit financial dealings, possibly involving land or property decades ago. And whatever it was important enough for him to carry a piece of evidence, the crucifix itself, and to write a desperate letter. But what could land acquisitions from decades past have to do with Brother Peter's murder now? And who would go to such lengths to keep it secret? The answer pointed to a truth far darker than simple financial malfeasance. It suggested a continuing threat, a conspiracy that had survived through generations within the Abbey. The architect of these shadows was still at large, and Eleanor knew she was getting dangerously close to uncovering them. The silence of the archive, once peaceful, now felt like the held breath of a predator, waiting. The revelation of the marked crucifix and the incriminating ledger sent a jolt through Eleanor. The faint impression of the crucifix on the ledger page confirmed Brother Peter's last known discovery. He hadn't just been studying, he had been investigating, and he had found something deeply unsettling in the Abbey's past. Eleanor meticulously copied the entries from the special accounts ledger, focusing on the ambiguous land acquisitions and relocation expenses. The dates spanned a period between 1855 and 1860, a time of significant expansion for the Abbey, but the records were deliberately vague, lacking the usual detail of other transactions. This suggested a concerted effort to conceal the true nature of these activities. She also noted the specific flaw on the silver crucifix, a tiny, almost invisible chip on one arm, just above the crossbeam. It was unique enough to confirm it was the same one found with Brother Peter. This small detail connected his discovery directly to his death. Someone had murdered him to silence him, to keep him from exposing what he had found in these records. Her next step was to delve into the local land records and historical archives in the nearby town of Havenwood. Officer Miller, though initially skeptical of her historical approach to a murder investigation, was swayed by the concrete evidence of the ledger and the crucifix. He arranged for a deputy to accompany Eleanor to the town hall. The town hall archives were dusty and ill-lit, filled with records far more mundane than the Abbey's spiritual tomes. But as Eleanor began to pore over the old property deeds and census records from the mid-1800s, a disturbing picture began to emerge. During the period of the special accounts ledger entries, 1855-1860, there were numerous records of small land parcels in the Havenwood area being acquired by the Abbey of St. Jude. Nothing inherently suspicious. However, alongside these acquisitions, there were also records of multiple families, mostly recent immigrants, selling their small plots of land at suspiciously low prices, and then, shortly after, disappearing from the local census records entirely. They weren't recorded as moving to other towns, they simply vanished. Their names were often common, making tracking difficult, but the pattern was undeniable. Eleanor found a few recurring surnames in these vanished families: O'Malley, Gallagher, Rossi. Names that hinted at Irish and Italian origins, likely seeking new lives in America. The records showed them selling their land to the Abbey, then no further trace. No forwarding addresses, no new census entries, no death records. Just a void. Then, a chilling detail emerged. One particular property, a small isolated farm on the outskirts of Havenwood, had been sold to the Abbey in 1858. The previous owner, a family named the O'Connors, had disappeared in the usual manner. But unlike other properties that were later leased or developed by the Abbey, this specific farm, according to subsequent maps and records, had simply been incorporated into the Abbey's sprawling land, its structures seemingly demolished. Yet, an old, hand-drawn map from the town's surveyor's office, dated 1862, showed a small, unmarked structure still present on that exact plot. A structure that did not appear on any official Abbey maps or later town records. It was as if it had been deliberately erased from existence. Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Relocation expenses disappeared. The low prices, and a mysteriously unlisted structure. It clicked into place. These families weren't just moving on, they were being moved, and perhaps permanently. She pulled out the Abbey's current map, provided by Father Michael, and compared it to the old surveyor's map. The unmarked structure on the O'Connor property was located deep within what was now a heavily wooded, seldom visited section of the Abbey grounds, far from the main buildings and public access. It was precisely the kind of place where something could be kept secret for decades. This was far beyond financial fraud. This hinted at coercion, possibly even violence. The discovery Brother Peter had made wasn't just about money. It was about lives, about a dark chapter in the Abbey's history involving these vanished families. And the crucifix, used as a bookmark in that specific ledger, was a silent witness to a crime that had been buried for generations. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. The sanctity of the Abbey of St. Jude was not just a facade. It was a deliberate deception, built upon a foundation of hidden truths and quite possibly buried bodies. The unsettling connection between the present murder and the past disappearances was now starkly clear. The shadow Brother Peter spoke of wasn't just a feeling, it was a physical place, a secret hidden within the Abbey's sprawling property, and someone was still willing to kill to keep it that way. The biting Massachusetts winter wind outside the archive windows suddenly felt like a mournful wail, carrying the echoes of forgotten victims. Armed with the historical maps and the chilling implications of the vanished families, Eleanor returned to the Abbey of St. Jude. The snow had temporarily ceased, leaving a crisp, brilliant landscape, but the beauty only served to highlight the ugliness of the secrets hidden beneath. She presented her findings to Officer Miller, who, despite his initial skepticism, now listened with growing alarm. "So you're saying this Abbey might have been involved in what? Forced disappearances? Decades ago?" Officer Miller's voice was low, laced with disbelief. "The pattern is too consistent to ignore," Eleanor replied, spreading the maps on a table in Father Michael's now occupied study. The abbot had been confined to his quarters while the investigation proceeded, a silent, watchful presence. Families selling at low prices, then vanishing. And this particular property, the O'Connor farm, where a structure appears on an old surveyor's map, but not on any of the Abbey's current records. She pointed to the faint outline on the old map, deep within the current wooded area. "It could be an old barn demolished years ago," Miller countered, though his tone lacked conviction. "Or," Eleanor interjected, "it could be something they wanted erased." The relocation expenses from the ledger, combined with the quick, unexplained vanishings, suggest something far more sinister than simple property acquisition. Brother Peter found something in those ledgers. He understood the connection, and it led to his death. The connection of the silver crucifix, Eleanor explained, sealed the theory. It wasn't just a random item. It was a link between Brother Peter's discovery and the dark past documented in the ledger. With the abbot's permission, albeit reluctant, and Officer Miller's support, Eleanor assembled a search party, including several groundskeepers and local deputies. Their target? The specific coordinates on the old surveyor's map, deep within the Abbey's expansive, rarely visited woodlands. The snow, though beautiful, made traversing the dense woods difficult, the drifts often reaching their knees. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their boots and the huffing of their breath in the cold air. After an hour of arduous trekking, guided by compass and map, they arrived at a clearing. It was a desolate, overgrown spot, choked with leafless bushes and skeletal trees. At first glance, there was nothing but a slight rise in the ground, covered in a thick layer of snow. But Eleanor's trained eye, looking for subtle disturbances, noticed something. A faint, almost imperceptible pattern in the way the snow lay, suggesting a larger, more regular mound beneath. And protruding from the snow, half buried, was a piece of weathered, roughly hewn stone, unlike the natural boulders of the area. "Here," Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper, pointing to the mound. "Start digging." The groundskeepers began to clear the snow, then carefully dug into the frozen earth. The ground was hard, resistant, But as they worked, the outlines of buried stone became clearer. It was not a natural formation. As more snow and earth were cleared, the grim truth emerged. What they uncovered was a small, crudely constructed stone building, mostly underground. Its roof collapsed inward. It was not a barn or a storage shed. It had the distinct look of a makeshift dwelling, almost a bunker. The entrance, facing away from the main abbey buildings, was almost completely covered by earth and fallen debris. Eleanor and Officer Miller carefully approached the exposed structure. The air around it was stagnant, chillingly still. There was a narrow, broken wooden door, partially obscured by a fallen beam. Eleanor squeezed through the opening, shining her lantern inside. The interior was small, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet, and utterly desolate. The ground was bare earth, and the walls were rough, unmortared stone, like the cavity where Brother Peter was found. There were no furnishings, no signs of recent human habitation. But on the floor, amidst the debris, Eleanor saw a few grim artifacts. A rusted tin cup, a child's broken wooden toy, and a few scattered, decaying scraps of cloth that looked like remnants of old clothing. And then, in a corner, partially hidden by fallen debris, she saw something else that made her blood run cold. A single small pile of human bones. They were old, brittle, bleached white with time, clearly belonging to multiple individuals. Among them, a tiny skull, unmistakably that of a child. Eleanor gasped, stepping back, the lantern trembling slightly in her hand. This wasn't just about hidden financial records. This was a hidden burial ground, a mass grave. The relocation expenses and disappearances in the ledger were now horrifyingly clear. These families hadn't moved on. They had been brought here, to this hidden sanctuary, and their lives had ended in this desolate, forgotten place. The air in the hidden structure felt heavy with the echoes of desperate lives and silent deaths. The sanctity of the Abbey of St. Jude was not merely compromised, it was utterly shattered. The true horror of the Abbey's past had been unveiled, and it was far more monstrous than Eleanor could have ever imagined. And somewhere, amongst the living, the person who knew this secret, the true architect of these shadows, was still waiting. The discovery of the hidden burial site sent shockwaves through the Abbey of St. Jude and beyond. Officer Miller immediately called for reinforcements, and the remote woodland clearing transformed into a grim scene of forensic investigation. The chilling reality of multiple decades-old murders now hung heavy over the seemingly devout institution. Eleanor, numb with the horror of what they had unearthed, returned to the Abbey's main building. Her mind was reeling, trying to process the enormity of the crime that had been covered up for so long. Brother Peter's death was no longer an isolated incident. It was the latest victim in a long line of atrocities perpetrated by or for the Abbey. She knew she needed to speak with Father Michael again, but this time, the conversation would be different. The time for polite inquiry was over. She found the abbot in his study, pacing nervously, his face etched with a desperate fear. When Eleanor entered, he stopped, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Father Michael," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of emotion, "we found them, the O'Connors, the O'Malleys, the Gallaghers, all of them, in a hidden grave in the woods." Father Michael swayed, gripping the edge of his desk. No, it cannot be. This is a holy place. These are fabrications." "The evidence speaks for itself," Eleanor countered, placing the old surveyor's map and copies of the problematic ledger entries on his desk. She also laid down a photograph of the hidden structure and the uncovered bones. "And Brother Peter found your secrets, didn't he? He found these records, this conspiracy, and you killed him to keep it buried." The abbot sank into his chair, his shoulders slumping. He covered his face with his hands, his body racked by silent sobs. For a long moment, only the sound of his ragged breathing filled the room. Finally, Father Michael looked up, his eyes bloodshot, filled with a tormented resignation. It was not I, detective. Not directly. But I knew. I knew of the darkness. Eleanor leaned forward. "Tell me everything." He began to speak, his voice raspy, a confession tumbling out in a torrent of guilt and despair. The story he recounted was a chilling tale of greed, fanaticism, and a desperate attempt to maintain power. In the mid-1800s, during a period of financial hardship for the Abbey, a particularly zealous and ruthless abbot, Father Ignatius, conceived of a scheme to expand the Abbey's land and influence. He believed the Abbey was destined for greatness, and that any means, no matter how unsavory, were justified for God's greater glory. He began to systematically acquire land from poor, often immigrant families who were struggling to survive the harsh New England winters. When some resisted or demanded fair prices, Father Ignatius and a small trusted circle of monks resorted to intimidation, coercion, and ultimately, violence. The families were forcibly removed from their lands, brought to the secluded structure in the woods, and left to perish, their deaths concealed as relocations. Their bodies were then hastily buried, and their existence erased from all official records. "It was done in secret," Father Michael whispered, his gaze fixed on some unseen horror. "Only a few knew. The Abbey prospered, grew wealthy. The secret was passed down from abbot to abbot, like a cursed inheritance. A burden of sin that no one dared expose for fear of destroying the Abbey's reputation, its very foundation." "And Brother Peter discovered this?" Eleanor pressed. "He was working in the archive, researching the Abbey's early benefactors," Father Michael explained, his voice thick with remorse. "He was meticulous. He found the special accounts ledger. He started asking questions. He realized the truth. He was going to expose us all." "Who killed him, Father?" Eleanor demanded, her voice cutting through his lament. "Who found out he knew and acted to silence him?" Father Michael hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. "Brother Gregory." Eleanor felt a jolt. Brother Gregory, the monastery's stern, unyielding master of novices, a man known for his rigid adherence to rules and his fierce loyalty to the Abbey. "Why him?" "Brother Gregory is a direct descendant of one of the original monks involved in Father Ignatius's scheme," Father Michael confessed, his voice trembling. "His family has been here for generations, intertwined with the Abbey's darkest secrets. He saw Brother Peter as a threat to everything his family and the Abbey represented. He acted to protect the secret, just as his ancestors had." The pieces fell into place with a sickening finality. The architect of the shadows was not just one man, but a legacy of darkness, passed down through generations, culminating in Brother Gregory's desperate act to preserve a monstrous secret. The sanctity of St. Jude was a carefully constructed lie, built upon the bones of the innocent. The chilling reality of the conspiracy, spanning decades, was now fully exposed, leaving behind only the cold, stark truth of human depravity, hidden beneath a veneer of piety. The revelation of Brother Gregory's involvement sent a jolt, an almost physical tremor, through the solemn, ancient walls of the Abbey of St. Jude. The confession, wrung from Father Michael by Eleanor's relentless pursuit of the truth, had shattered the monastery's deceptive veneer of piety. Officer Miller, his face grim, wasted no time. Upon hearing the abbot's fractured admissions, he immediately dispatched deputies to apprehend Brother Gregory. They found him in his Spartan cell, not in prayer or meditation, but meticulously packing a small satchel, as if preparing for a long and inevitable journey. He offered no resistance, no plea of innocence, his face a mask of grim, almost zealous determination that spoke volumes of his conviction in his twisted cause. Eleanor stood observing from the periphery as Brother Gregory was led away, his silhouette stark against the arched corridors. His silence was more chilling than any defiant outburst, more unnerving than any desperate plea. It was a silence born of unwavering loyalty to a dark, inherited secret, a bond forged not in faith, but in blood and deceit. His actions, Eleanor understood, were not merely about protecting the Abbey's immediate reputation or its present standing. They were about preserving a twisted legacy of power and control, a lineage of deception passed down through generations, ensuring the Abbey's illicit gains and hidden crimes remained buried. With Brother Gregory now in custody, the full, horrifying extent of the conspiracy began to unravel with an accelerating, sickening momentum. Under intense, prolonged questioning, Father Michael, now completely broken by the weight of his conscience, provided more and more details. He described the location of the hidden structure, a makeshift prison and grave. He recounted in agonizing detail the callous methods used to silence the immigrant families who dared to resist, and the intricate, decades-long web of deception that had kept the truth of their disappearance and their murders buried so profoundly. The cold, brutal truth of the Abbey's history, steeped in land fraud, coercion, and multiple murders, would soon be thrust into the unwelcome glare of public knowledge. Concurrently, the forensic teams worked tirelessly, their focused efforts a stark contrast to the Abbey's shattered peace at the hidden burial site, deep within the secluded woods. Each shovel of frozen earth, each carefully exhumed bone, was a silent, eloquent testament to a forgotten life, a voice finally given volume after half a century of enforced silence. The medical examiner, after a swift but thorough initial examination, confirmed that Brother Peter had died of suffocation, confirming Eleanor's chilling initial assessment from the tiny, cramped cavity. The single faint scratch mark on the rough stone wall of that hidden space, she realized with a pang of understanding, was likely Brother Peter's desperate final attempt to leave a mark, a silent scream for help that, against all odds, would eventually lead them to the damning truth. The tarnished silver crucifix, with its unique, almost imperceptible flaw on one arm, became not just a piece of evidence, but a potent symbolic representation of the Abbey's corrupted faith. It wasn't merely a link physically connecting Brother Peter to the special accounts ledger and his fatal discovery. It was a holy object, consecrated to purity, that had been deliberately used to mark a wickedly kept secret, a silent desecration echoing through time. Over the next few days, as the relentless Massachusetts snow began its slow, inevitable melt, revealing the scarred and churned earth beneath, the Abbey of St. Jude transformed. It became a hub of intense, almost frantic activity, but certainly not of prayer. The monastic calm was shattered by the incessant hum of reporters' cameras and the hurried murmurs of their conversations. Journalists, smelling blood in the water, descended upon the once isolated monastery, their cameras flashing, their notebooks eager to capture every detail of the shocking story of a sacred institution built on a foundation of lies. The monks themselves, once a unified, silent brotherhood, were now fractured, their ranks divided. Some were distraught and openly weeping, others remained in hardened denial, while many more were simply consumed by overwhelming shame. Eleanor, weary from the relentless pursuit but resolutely committed to seeing justice served, oversaw the final crucial stages of the investigation. The unburdening of St. Jude was a painful, agonizing process, a necessary ripping open of old wounds that exposed deep-seated corruption and shattered decades of carefully constructed perceived sanctity. The full force of the law would now fall upon those responsible, and the long-forgotten memory of the vanished families would finally, after so many years, receive the justice they were denied in life. Before leaving the Abbey for what she knew would be the last time, Eleanor took a quiet moment to stand alone in the main chapel. The air, which had once been thick with the comforting scent of incense and the solemn murmur of devotion, now felt hollow, tainted by the echoing specters of past suffering. She looked at the ornate altar, the vibrant, shattered beauty of the stained glass windows, and the rows of empty pews that once held fervent believers. The haunting image of Brother Peter's young, terrified face in that hidden cavity flashed vividly in her mind. He had sought the truth, driven by a quiet, unwavering moral compass, and in doing so had paid the ultimate price. But his sacrifice, Eleanor knew, was far from in vain. His quiet investigation, his desperate unsent letter, and ultimately the grim discovery of his body, had finally, undeniably, brought light to the darkest corners of the Abbey of St. Jude. The intricate mystery that had begun with a whisper of winter, shrouded in a blanket of snow and monastic silence, had ended with a shattering revelation, tearing down a wall of deception that had stood unchallenged for half a century. Eleanor Vance, the quiet, observant detective from a world away, had methodically peeled back the layers of piety and silence to expose the raw, unforgivable human depravity festering beneath. The Abbey of St. Jude would never be the same. Its future, like the melting snow, was uncertain, but one thing was undeniably clear. The truth, however cold and brutal, would no longer be buried. The strange vanishing of the Abbey Acolytes had finally ended, but its chilling, dark legacy would forever haunt the hallowed, now defiled grounds of St. Jude. If you were gripped by the chilling secrets of the Abbey of St. Jude, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more captivating mysteries. This is a work of fiction,